pharmacology, there's a concept called the minimum effective dose. That is, a dosage of a drug that leads to the desired effect in most patients. As strength training is literally medicine in disguise, the same concept can and has been applied to resistance training. It's called the minimum effective training dose. So what is the minimum effective training dose?
The minimum dose concept is essentially what is the least you can do in order to get a meaningful response out of your training. So we're talking about training here.
That was Dr. Patroklos Androulakis-Korakakis, aka Dr. Pac, who acquired his PhD from Science University looking at the topic of minimum effective training dose on trained individuals and powerlifters more specifically. So to recap, minimum effective training dose refers to training with the lowest possible training volume while still experiencing meaningful strength gains. To borrow yet another concept from medicine, the dose-response relationship. The dose-response relationship refers to the relationship between the amount or dose of a substance that is administered or received and the effect or response it produces in the body. Purely in terms of strength, there is likely a dose-response relationship between the amount of training you do and the strength adaptation you get. In other words, the more volume you do, the more gains you'll likely see, to a point. For the optimal bros out there, you may wonder why one would choose to do the very least training possible and potentially risk the gains we have achieved when seeking an optimal training dosage. If you've been training for years, however, you know that sometimes going all out 12 hours a week just isn't going to happen. By forcing yourself to do 2-hour workouts 6 days a week when you have a hectic job, a newborn baby, a relationship to take care of, and that Instagram page of yours to update so that you still look sane, you may just shoot yourself in the foot by missing a workout here and there, stressing out about it, and overall feeling bad because you can't hit your target lifts because of everything going on. That's where minimum effective training dose comes into the picture.
Minimum effective dose as a concept is a useful concept for periods where time is limited, periods where recovery resources are also limited, so potentially sleep is low, stress is high, and at the same time it can, and that's coming from me as a practitioner, so as a coach, it can be a very useful concept for periods of time where psychological fatigue is also high and where training motivation is quite low. But it can also serve as a baseline, as a way to find your baseline or your athlete's baseline. So if you know that, hey, we only need to do X amount of sets to get meaningfully stronger, that could be your reference point to start a mesocycle for somebody, or to build your mesocycle and potentially go slightly higher than that, but not much higher than that.
So the minimum effective training dose may be valuable for many scenarios, but how should you apply it if your only goal is to increase strength?
So for strength, for meaningful increases in 1 repetition maximum strength in powerlifters, I would say somewhere between 3 to 6 sets per lift per week. Those sets being somewhere around the ballpark of 1 to 5 reps and around 80 to 95% of your 1RM, obviously with the latter being more suitable for single repetitions and so on and so forth. With our studies essentially showing that a protocol implementing singles, auto-regulated singles on RP 9 to 9.5, followed by 2 sets of 3 reps at 80% of the single performed, were better than the other protocols that we employed. But obviously I'm not saying, hey, use that exact protocol, but in our protocols for the squat, people did around 6 sets per week. For the deadlift, they did 3 sets per week, and for the bench, they did 9 sets per week with that sort of setup. The 1 set was a single, 2 sets were a triple, and then that was either times 2 for the squat, times 3 for the bench, and times 1 for the deadlift. And from my literature review, which I redid my literature review after a year and a half after it was published in order to see if there was any more data on the topic. So my literature review focused on just resistance trained individuals, and for those we found that a single set performed 2 to 3 times per week, so that would be around 2 to 3 sets per week, with loads ranging from 70 to 85% 1RM, and that set performed to failure or volitional failure, was enough to induce increases in 1 repetition maximum strength in the squat and the bench press, because there was no data on the deadlift. So if you're not a powerlifter and you're just somebody out there who is after getting stronger, a couple of sets, 2 to 3 sets per lift per week will be enough for you to meaningfully increase your strength for 6 to 12 weeks, as long as those sets are heavy enough, so 70% plus 1 rep, percentage of your 1 rep, and close to failure. And just to add that little note, because I did it for the powerlifters, what came out of the PhD was that such a type of training, so the 3 to 6 sets I mentioned, well, 3 to 9 in some cases, per lift per week, would be effective for around 6 to 12 weeks for most powerlifters.
So at this point, you may recognize the utility of a minimum effective training dose approach. It has many potential use cases and benefits, but you may want to consider a few aspects when using this concept. Let's discuss the pros and cons.
Pros, it's very simple, time efficient, and if you are not after maximizing results, you could just train like that for the rest of your life. And especially if you've built a bunch of muscle, you can still maintain a really solid physique and solid strength with just very little training. Cons, there will come a point where you will need to add volume, and it won't be effective because it's so little. It can be boring, especially if you're doing just the same lifts. Obviously, you could change lifts to account for that. And I'd say, lastly, if you're a power lifter and you're trying to increase powerlifting strength and you only have a handful of sets available as your main tool of training, you may find that there is some overuse injuries that come with it, because if you're just doing a handful of sets, they probably need to be very specific, so you're essentially going to be doing a bunch of SPD training.
It's important to note that you should treat minimum effective training dose more as a concept than a method per se. It's more than likely that the minimum stimulus required to initiate the adaptation response, or so-called adaptive threshold, is a moving target, which is affected by previous training volume and load, your recovery and adaptation capacity, and all other external factors, just to name a few.
Like your minimum effective dose may be changing over time, so you could start extremely low and then up that minimum dose to a renewed minimum dose after 6 weeks by adding a set or two with just some small changes. But I'd say I would be very confident in seeing it work, especially in powerlifters or people after 1 arm strength increases for 6 to 8 weeks, and after that needing to reassess. I'd say a good reassessment point would be somewhere after 6 to 8 weeks. But because you will be training with very little volume and very intense sets, those sets can be somewhat indicative of how things are going. So if you're seeing that performance is slowly increasing over time and you're feeling good, then that's a sign for you to potentially continue on the minimum dose. If you've been stuck on the same numbers for all your top sets, and after 6 to 8 weeks, let's say you do it for 6 to 8 weeks, it works great, but after the next 6 to 8 weeks, when you retest, you see that there hasn't been any change to your strength, while also training was not feeling great while you're going through your training, then it may be time where you up that volume.
To summarize, the minimum effective training dose is the lowest amount of training one needs to do to see strength improvements. This concept can be beneficial in cases where the goal is to allow for more recovery, such as tapering or deloading, or when training around injury, for example, or in cases where time is limited for one reason or another. When considering implementing this approach, it's probably advisable to start with 2 to 3 sets per lift per week, and if you have the resources, you can scale up from there to 4 to 6 sets. This could mean 1 to 3 workouts per week where volume is divided across training sessions. Ultimately, your minimum effective training dose may vary over time, so you should assess your performance trend weekly and reassess accordingly. This approach will likely work for 6 to 12 weeks, but volume increases may be needed afterwards. Depending on your goal and background, you could utilize loads from 70% all the way to 95% of your 1 repetition maximum. With this approach, you should probably be training pretty close to failure, so shoot for an RP of 6 to 9 or leave 1 to 4 repetitions in reserve.